Bienvenidos sean todos ustedes. Welcome everybody to this special transmission, and we are going to tackle one of the favorite topics that we have here in Churros y Palomitas, and it's about storytelling. And to talk about a very specific area, I am really glad to present to today's guest. Joining us all around from the other side of the world, we have Patrick Beja. How are you doing, Patrick?
Hey, thanks for having me, Dan. It's so nice to be on one of your shows for a change.
Yeah, it's part of the, I don't know, the democratizing of the leveling of the participating in different shows. So we can be both in each other's. If you don't know him, Patrick is a really cool content creator, as I describe him. He has a lot of shows. One of my favorites is the Phileas Club. And one of the reasons that one of the main reasons of why we are having him in here is because we're going to discuss about video games. And he's an expert. He has been working, not only on commenting, but he has been in both sides of the street, if we can say it like that. You were working previously in Blizzard, is that correct?
Yeah, I was. I wasn't in development. I was working in the PR, on the PR side of things. But yeah, I did work for Blizzard for a few years, and I've been playing games for a very long time and commenting for a while as well. I've been a journalist here and there and a podcaster for the past few years.
So there you have it. If you want to check more about the content, you can pretty much just Google and go to French Spin, and I will tell you at the end the specific page where you can find one of his many shows. So, Patrick, the purpose of this talk is to discuss a little bit about how the narrative has been evolving. Because, for example, games when were first released in the 70s and 80s, they have a pretty much like let's say they had not really a complicated storyline. It was pretty much like Mario saving the gear or something like that. So how do you think this evolution of the storytelling has come? Do you think that there's like perhaps a point where we as players realized that we wanted more, or it was like when we changed platforms from the arcades to home? Can we like find a specific point where the narrative started evolving?
I think it's really difficult to pinpoint one specific moment, but I do have to say that even in the, maybe not 70s, but at least 80s, with the very limited graphics that we had, there was one game called Adventure on the Atari, and that managed to create some kind of storyline, or maybe not storyline, but at least some feeling of discovery and adventure. It wasn't very complex, and you were this tiny little pixel that would go around into different areas, but still it was more complex than just a platformer game. I think so, and that was on a console, and I think that is maybe not necessarily the key moment, but it has more to do with the format. If you are talking about people playing in the arcades, it's people who are playing for a few minutes, maybe half an hour at a time. So you're going to want to give them some relatively short experiences. But when you start going into the home with home consoles, or the PC as well, of course, you start having people who can play for multiple hours at a time, and then you want to develop for some of the games, something that is a little bit more a longer story for them to follow, or you have that possibility at least. So I would say when the gaming devices came into the home and people had more time to spend on them.
And it's interesting because, as you mentioned, well, the switch that we had, but perhaps with not the format, with the platform, started requiring this. I remember like early Atari games, like the Gauntlet series. Well, they had the translation of the RPGs to in this case, to the screen that you could go and play with your friends in the arcade place. And after that, for example, in the 90s, I was a really fan of the fighting games, the 2D style. So the Street Fighters, the King of Fighters, the Art of Fighting, and all the fighters fighting
Yeah.
were like all the deserved all the hype in the time. And they actually started to contributing with something that wasn't seen before. That is like you can play with different kind of characters, but also that you have different kind of endings. And for example, for the Street Fighter 2, which was like the most popular game in the series at the time, perhaps the storylines weren't like really complicated. I remember that you were Ryu, so you were always looking for the next fighter. So it was like really simple, but at least you could identify with the characters. Do you think that this has also come part in the developing of the narratives so the player can identify with some of the characters that are available?
I think games like fighting games are an interesting case because you, to be honest, I don't think they're very good narrative experiences.
I agree.
Because they have to fit so many different stories into that overarching narrative. But that's the kind of problems that we've never had before, and we never had to tackle in art forms. So it is a new and different way of looking at narration. Unfortunately, I don't think we found, even today, we haven't found a formula that really works. Even to this day, when you have more than 2 or 3 characters, you're going to end up with a story that is probably convoluted and not very satisfying. So it's an interesting issue, but I wouldn't say, or, challenge, but I wouldn't say that we've managed to overcome it to this day. The single player experiences offer more opportunities for narrative design than multiplayer arcade games. And obviously, in a game like Street Fighter, the focus is very much the fights, the mechanical skill that you're going to improve to master the game rather than following the story along. It's a nice bonus, and I spent some time following that story, but I wouldn't say it's very satisfying.
And it's interesting because right now we have for example, a point where video games are actually being more appreciated in different ceremonies, in different award ceremonies. And for example, one of the main developers or of the main franchises is the Gone Home franchise, the Gone Home series. And for example, when we look at in this case at the homepage, you actually look that they have, like, if it was a film, the different kind of awards of considerations that they have, and even the best debut for the BAFTA awards. And BAFTA, well, they give awards for movies, for TV shows, and actually they have starting to recognize the work that is being done in this kind of storytelling. So we're sort of like in a mix, I believe, where actually games are getting more cinematic in the way that they want to tell more compelling stories. You were mentioning in email conversation that we had before that there are some of these games that are actually like really representative of how these have been evolved. Can you tell us a little bit in this case about the Gone Home series?
Yeah, I think Gone Home, it's one game. It's not a series, but yeah, the Gone Home is a very interesting example because it almost contradicts what people had come to associate with the idea of video game, which is gameplay and interactivity. It wasn't the first game in that genre, but it was probably the most successful one, and people call them walking simulator, meaning you really do nothing but walk around and the story is told to you in what is probably the closest to a cinematic way in a video game. So essentially you just walk around and you look at things, and maybe you're going to hear some audio log, some dialogue, and you're going to find some, not even clues. It's not like you're trying to solve a mystery, although there will be things that you find that enable you to go to another part of the game. And you're really going to be experiencing the story in that way with some interactive elements, but not many of them.
Hmm.
So I think Gone Home, which came out maybe 5 or 6 years ago, it's a relatively short experience. It's maybe 2 hours. So it's closer to what you expect for a movie. And it's really just about that story and what happened there, and you get it, and then you kind of never play it again. I guess you can play it again just like you watch a movie again, but it's not something like Street Fighter, which we were just talking, but that you're going to play over and over again to improve your mechanical skills. And initially, I think there was some resistance in the gaming community to these types of games, but Gone Home kind of legitimized that idea and showed that games can be many different things, including a thing where you don't quite play very much. You
Hmm.
just observe and experience the thing. So I think Gone Home was really an important step in diversifying the type of games and the types of narrative experiences you could have in games.
And it's kind of interesting because I was mentioning cinema. Well, this show is usually mainly about cinema, but also storytelling. Because in the cinema, you are having a very passive experience. You're pretty much sitting in a couch or sitting on the movie theater and just being receptive to whatever is projected on the screen. So this game was sort of, I don't know, like a first step in this case, because as you mentioned, one of the things that you do is pretty much just walking around, walking around. Kevin Smith
Hmm.
would say that is like one of the Lord of the Ring movies where they are just walking one side to the other side of the country, but you are actually participating in a way and getting in this story. After that, we have some other games. For example, a couple that I want to mention, and one of these is Heavy Rain, which was really interesting because you had a lot of endings in this game. First for the PS3 and then for the PS4. So you have like the perspective of some of the characters. However, one of the main jumping points, I believe, is the Last of Us, which I remember one of my friends at work was like, "Man, you have to play this because the storyline is really cool." And you see that they actually took care of casting real voice actors or actors in this case for some of the characters, and perhaps you could see some similarities with previously established narratives from movies or from other kind of experiences. However, they actually got the point and make an extra effort to tell a compelling storytelling. And for example, perhaps I don't feel identified as one of the main characters that we're looking in here, but the story is so compelling that you want to be part of this. Have you played any of the Last of Us games, Patrick?
Yeah, I think The Last of Us, the first one, the second one is going to be coming out hopefully maybe this year, maybe next year. But the first one is one of my favorite games of all time. And it's a really interesting case because I mean there are many different games that we could talk about when we're talking about narrative experiences. Even something as early as the first Zelda has
Hmm.
so arguably some kind of narrative, although I could, it's more of a gameplay game than a narrative game, but still you could argue there is. um and certainly some of the old school Japanese RPGs and some of the old school Western RPGs as well had a lot of story. um the Last of Us took it to a more cinematic. I mean, we could talk about Telltale games as well, but
Mhm.
Telltale games were more about, in the same way that Gone Home was very much focused on storytelling. The Last of Us excelled in cinematic feeling, and it had some really good gameplay. It was a game, first of all, and it married gameplay experiences with narrative experiences. Now, the gameplay is not always the best game ever, but it's really solid. There's some really enjoyable gameplay to be had, and it also makes the story part of what you're going through. Most of the time, it's going to be through cinematic scenes. So, as you mentioned, they did hire some real actors with motion capture to an extent that we never really had seen before. There were some other games, even the games from Naughty Dog, who made the Uncharted series. You had a lot of motion capture there, but in The Last of Us, it kind of came to a climax. And the way they tell the story, I don't want to spoil the game because the story is very important, but they make you feel by playing many of the times you're going to be playing the game, you're going to feel what the story is telling you to feel. And up to, I would argue, possibly Celeste, which is a very different game and a brilliant game as well, which has very basic graphics, ironically. I would say The Last of Us was the best example of putting story into not moment to moment gameplay, but the evolution of your character and the relationship between the two main characters. The Last of Us is absolutely one of the most incredible storytelling in any medium. We're talking about video games, of course, but I would argue that the things it says about the two characters and to the player who is experiencing that story are just as powerful and masterful as they are in the best movies. So in that sense, it's a height that games rarely attain. It's not impossible. It happens sometimes, but The Last of Us is certainly at the top of that list, which isn't incredibly long.
Yeah, that's actually one of the things because I believe that we are like trying to reach these points, and also one of the things that I want to talk about it's how the medium where you are consuming, in this case the stories, or in this case the games, actually affects the way that you are getting involved in the story. As we mentioned before, well, we have the arcade games, and we have the home consoles like the NES, the Atari, the Sega Genesis, or right now, well, with the latest generation with the PS. The PlayStation and the Xbox, and you always have this sort of interface that it's mainly like, for example, like the control pad. But for example, there are other games. If you are a hardcore gamer, perhaps you are like wanting to be considered in a different category because your main tool is the keyboard, and some of the games that actually even though you use something as mundane as a keyboard, started developing this kind of storylines were actually for part of Blizzard. I remember Diablo 2, which was one of the games that was really popular because you didn't need the latest video card to play it, and it also had some cinematics, but still you were using, as I mentioned, the regular mouse or the keyboard to interact. Then we have this other thing. Right now we have VR tools. We have mainly for the PlayStation, and it was an interesting exercise for part of Microsoft to use your own body as part of the gaming tools. Do you think that the interface affects the storytelling, or is something completely different in regards of the story?
I think the interface is can affect the storytelling, but many times it's the story and your involvement in that story can be affected regardless of the interface. For some reason, I'm reminded of, I think it was Modern Warfare 1 or 2. And when you think about Call of Duty, it was one of the Call of Duty games. You don't necessarily think about storytelling and the power of that kind of experience for that medium. It's a simple shooting game. But in those games, there were a lot of innovations made in storytelling. And I remember one of the moments, which was you were in a helicopter as a soldier, and you were trying to flee the explosion of an atomic bomb. And so you failed to disarm it, I think, and you get into the chopper and you fly away. And you see it from the eyes, because it's a first-person shooter, you see it from the eyes of your soldier. And the bomb goes off after you've tried to get away as fast as you could, but you weren't far enough, so your helicopter goes down, and you are in control, not in control when you have the initial the helicopter going down, but then the screen comes back. Of course, it goes to black, and then the screen comes back, and you are in the wreck of the helicopter, but you're still alive. And the game doesn't really tell you anything, but you're used to going forward or backwards with your keyboard or joystick. And so you just move forward, and you're, as the character, you're on the ground. So you move very slowly, and you can see the character, crawling in the wreckage. And the thing lasts for, I don't know, maybe 10 seconds, 15 seconds. And then the character stops, and everything fades back to black. So you understand that the character just died. Your character, you died in the game. And this is something that could have existed in a movie, but I would argue it wouldn't make much sense in a movie, right? You just show the character and he crawls around and then he dies. I guess it could work, but when you are the one just pressing just one key on your keyboard to move forward, it changes the way you experience that scene. So I think, and it was very powerful in the game. So I think that the medium, to get back to your question, things like VR and things like that can give more immersion, and maybe it will enhance those types of experiences. But I think you can get those types of experiences even with pretty minimal graphics. And it's a bonus to have better graphics, better immersion, and certainly VR, when it's done well, it's not very often done well, but when it's done well, it can create something truly exceptional. But I'm not sure that it's that the things it can create can't be recreated with simpler graphics. I don't know if maybe I should talk about Celeste again.
Mm-hmm.
Celeste is a game that is completely pixel graphic, retro graphics. Essentially, it looks like a game from 1990. But it tells the story of a young girl who wants to climb a mountain, and the game is very difficult, and climbing a mountain is very difficult. And she meets basically her negativity manifests as a character that is going to try and prevent you from climbing the mountain. And I'm not going to go into it too much more, but essentially, even with those basic graphics, the game makes you experience what the story is telling you. Just like trying to crawl as your soldier character in the wreckage of a downed helicopter makes you feel more than if you had just seen it on screen. And Celeste is something that is incredible for that reason. Again, very mechanically demanding game, but it integrates the story into that idea incredibly well. And it doesn't need VR, it doesn't need 3D graphics, it doesn't need anything like that. So I am looking forward to the day VR games are mastered in the same way. But I think today we can have some incredible experiences already. So I don't know if that answers your question, but that's how I feel about it.
Yeah, and for example, that's a different point for, in this case, for debate, because in the we have, like, for example, a school in the filmmaking community where they want to make the story, the experience, in a way that you get more involved. And for example, the main tool that the storyteller has is the story. So it actually doesn't matter what are the tools as long as the story is well told and the people care about it. And for example, we had the 3D wave, and we have a lot of films that didn't deserve a 3D treatment perhaps you wanted all the show, the things flying right at your face, something like that, because that was new. But then you have some of the main directors. Martin Scorsese directed one of the best made films for 3D with Hugo Cabret, and we had also Wim Wenders with Pina, which is a documentary, but the 3D was actually part of the experience. And we have the Cave of the Forgotten Dreams, where you actually got in one of the caves with one of the earliest paintings made for humans in some of the caves located in France. But for example, it was the latest film was done with a really rudimentary camera, a 3D camera, a Panasonic that you could buy, and it was really cheap. But the thing is that it was part of the experience because you weren't able to get into these caves. So the filmmaker was taking you to this place, and it was an important moment to share this experience. And then we have a different way where we have filmmakers like Alejandro González Iñárritu with he won not in the latest Academy Awards ceremony, but in the previous one, he won a special award for Carne y Arena, Flesh and Sand, which is a virtual experience. Created using filmmaking tools, where you were wearing a headset and you were taking part. These are some of the scenes of how it was made, and you can actually share the experience of crossing the frontier and getting persecuted by the migra. So in the film, they wanted to feel like if you were part of an experience where you were an active part. And it's kind of interesting because they are trying of pushing here. And in the other hand, you actually show us with the Celeste game that, okay, perhaps you want to be more realist. You want to put more realism in the graphics in this case, or in the experience, like in the Batman, the latest Arkham game was using some of the VR tools. However, the most important thing is that you get involved in the story. So it's kind of interesting having both situations in here. I want to talk about a different series, one that I remember that I got the first game for the PlayStation 3, and I was holding my money. I didn't buy a PlayStation 4, and I was like, well, perhaps I will buy it when they come with this game, and it's the Red Dead Redemption. So when they announced it, I was like, damn, I have to spend some money on this console that I actually don't need. But one of the things that was really interesting, and it got my attention from the first title, from the title of the PS3, is that you actually have a story that perhaps has a lot of cliches that you have been in different games, in different movies, but it actually attracts your attention. Can you tell us a little bit about the Red Dead Redemption series?
Yeah, I haven't finished Red Dead Redemption 2 for a number of reasons I could discuss, but I've played a fair amount, and I've finished the first one. It was one of the best games of the previous generation. It's an interesting approach because the people at Rockstar really tried to make a game that is as immersive and realistic as possible. And the gameplay is almost secondary to that feeling that they wanted to evoke of being in that Far West cowboy land. And they've succeeded at that in many, many ways. The gameplay, I think, in the second one is a hindrance. But if we're talking about storytelling, I think there are really two different parts of the conversation. One is the actual story, which in the first one was really interesting. And the second one, it seems that it takes its time to get to the point. But when it does, it's interesting as well. And there's but I wouldn't say they were, well, actually they were pretty good. But some of the missions are a little bit mundane, but then they gain value because you have that feeling of presence in that other place, that simulation of another place. And that's also something that you can do in video games that is maybe a little bit more difficult to do in films. But in the second one, they took it to such an extreme that it can be difficult to enjoy for some people. Some examples of the way it is extreme is they try to make you inhabit the character for everything you do. So, for example, if you want to uh, uh, get something from, loot a body from someone you just killed, you will grab the person, turn them around, rummage in their pockets, and grab something and put it in your pockets, it takes not very long. It takes a couple of seconds. But since it's also still a video game, and you end up shooting 30 people, in a shootout, and by yourself, you can't loot the 30 people, and that's by design. It's because the other people are going to show up and realize what's been happening. It's by design, arguably. It's, well, if you kill 30 people, you're not going to have time in real life. This is a terrible example, but in real life, you're maybe not going to have time to loot all of them before the police arrives. um but this is still a video game. So there's this push and pull between trying to be realistic and trying to make a video game, which um so they exceed in some ways in the game, but also maybe that conflict makes it a little bit unsettling for gamers in other ways. So I don't know. There are some incredible things, and some things that Red Dead Redemption 2 and even the first one did that no one had done before, that are incredible in that sense of immersion. Um, but I don't know. I mean, the story in the first one was incredible and revolutionary at the time. In the second one, I haven't played it, but my feeling is it doesn't reach that high bar that the first one set.
Hmm.
In realism, though, in immersion, it's above anything you've ever seen. So it's another thing. The feeling, the conclusion that this leads me to is that video games are incredibly complex. They're more complex than any form of art that we have ever created, in the sense that you can have, there's the previous one was probably movies, because in movies you had like storytelling, music, performance, like artistic actor performance, etc. In video games, you have all of that, and you have the mix of interaction and presence and all of that. So there are so many things you need to get right to make a video game that is incredibly exceptional. It's almost impossible. And there are so many different kinds of video games, even more than there are different kinds of movies, and there are many different kinds of movies. So I don't know what that says about Red Dead Redemption, the series, but it's an incredible achievement, but maybe not in all the ways that video games can be.
And yeah, because it's also, and you mentioned one really important thing, Patrick, is that it's not like, for example, just a genre. It's actually a medium. So we're not talking about the best thriller. We're not talking about the best horror game. We're talking about an entire medium that can explore different aspects. And perhaps in this case, the Western is the one of the most successful genres that has been adapted. It's not the only one. But for example, it's like, I remember the old blockbusters when you had the different sections for movies. And in Mexico, they had like, okay, drama, action, comedy, romance, and then Mexican films. Like the Mexican films was only one genre, and all the Mexican films that just deal with one thing. If you go to film festivals, you can feel like that because there are pretty much slow films or something like that. However, it's the same for video games. So perhaps we can develop certain things. I remember the Batman game, the Arkham Knight, the one that came for the VR, that they had one of the best uses of the VR elements, and they integrated actually in the story how you put the in this case the helmet or the mask of the Batman, so you could get and familiarize with the use of the different tools, the interface that we were mentioned. But that's just one example. The game, as you mentioned, we have different things. The Celeste game is really good because it's explores the story. So one final question before we finish this transmission, Patrick. So where do you think, or when do you think we will be comparing or taking more seriously video games as a medium of telling stories? Because we have the talk about, well, they are getting more recognition, in this case by the BAFTA awards or different kind of awards, but they are still like the little brother of cinema. So when do you think that it will be like pair on pair with different kind of narrative, like TV awards or the film awards, and then the video games awards will get the same respect as his siblings?
I think it's really a question of generation. If you talk to people in my generation that grew up with games, it's not necessarily the same, it's not an equivalent, but certainly games can evoke just as much, just as many feelings as movies can. And people in my generation, I think most of them have a love for both types of medium, just like we love some TV shows and many different kinds of mediums. I think people in previous generations have an impression of video games that is different because they don't really understand them, and they look at them from the outside. People who have played games like Red Dead Redemption and The Last of Us and Celeste and Gone Home and all of these types of games, we look at them and we don't see as the little brother of movies. We see it as something different that can be just as powerful. So to answer your question, when will they stop being the younger brother? I think once it's just like Kylo Ren kind of evokes in The Last Jedi. You have to let old things die. Maybe not kill them if you have to, maybe not go that far, but it's the same with everything. I'm sure when movies first started, and also we have to mention video games are like 30, 40 years old. Look at where movies were when they were 30 years old. It was a very different type of experience. But when movies first started, people looked at them and thought, this is silly child's play. A good book is what you need to evoke feelings and stuff like that. So it's a question of generation. Once those people who don't understand video games are not with us anymore, sadly, we will probably have more respect for that medium. For people like me and my crowd, we already do. So I don't really even care about those other people.
You're selfish in that way. No, but actually, as you mentioned, it's part of a generation switch change, and you can see it. For example, right now the electronic sports, the esports are taking a lot of attention from the general audiences because perhaps it's a wave of fashion. It's something that it's right now on the minds of a lot of people, but that also helps to get more acceptance for the general audiences. So, Patrick, if people want to hear more about this, they can find you really easily, right?
Yeah, sure. I talk about video games and many other things. The best way to do it is to follow me on Twitter. I'm not Patrick on Twitter. But if you enjoy video games especially, I do a show in English. I happen to be French, so I do shows in French and in English. But since we're speaking English, I do a show about gaming in English, and it's called Pixels. So if you enjoy podcasts, you can go to your podcast app and just look for Pixels. Do the search function and look for Pixels, and you will find my show. So that's where you can find me the easiest.
Excellent. And you will also have the links on the show notes of this episode. And I want to mention some of final comments in here from the audience, because we actually had audience from Mexico who woke up really early to watch this.
Thank you.
Greetings to Logan. And he mentioned that, for example, the Red Dead Redemption remake almost achieved that. A lot of people don't care about history anymore, that they use one battle royale games like Fortnite, and that's actually a good point. It's one of the most popular games in gaming history. And also saludos a Frankie and Logan. They are actually reminding me that I have to go to work in a few minutes. Thanks for watching. And Patrick, thank you very much for your time. It was a real pleasure talking with you about this topic.
Thank you very much for having me, Dan.
All right, here go the end credits, and we're going to record a small question for the patrons. Stay around if you're a patron, and if not, well, thank you very much for your time.